Greetings, Mark Garang here, publisher of the Conway Daily Sun, and today is one of my regular guests, George Epstein. George, how are you?
Very good.
Good. We haven't been together in a while. Everybody's busy, holidays and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But we've got holidays coming up. So we're going to jump around with a few topics. Let's start off with everybody's favorite topic locally, affordable housing.
Yeah.
And there was an interesting story about how affordable housing doesn't cause property taxes to rise. So what do you think about that?
I think the Sun has a challenge, like all small papers, in terms of sourcing articles, finding information, and you take information from hopefully credible sources when you run an article. And you ran an article with a professor, supposedly a professor emeritus from UNH, who made the claim that, at least the implication, that the addition of affordable housing and the children that brings doesn't raise property taxes. And affordable housing is important, it needs to be done, but the realtors promoted this thing, they paid for this supposed study, and it bothers me because it's bad science, it's bad mathematics, and it should be pointed out. So, for example, when you were in junior high, you had some science teacher who said this is the scientific method where you form a hypothesis, you run an experiment, and you either prove or disprove. You don't disprove. Either you prove or you don't prove the hypothesis. You can't disprove your hypothesis. You can only not prove it. And you had this article promoted by the realtors where this guy did a study and he couldn't find whether affordable housing increased the property taxes in communities. And the implication was it doesn't, which is just false. And it was not, excuse me, it wasn't demonstrated at all that was the case. And
he was trying to prove the negative and he couldn't.
Except he didn't even claim to prove the negative. Because he couldn't prove the positive, he assumed the negative, I guess. It was bad science, it was bad math. The video that he produced, I went out and looked at it, was cited in the article on the realtor's website, and it was ridiculous, honestly. It had him sitting in, I think, a dining hall at UNH, trying to look like he was a college professor, and perhaps he is, but the whole thing was kind of an embarrassment. There have been a lot of studies, and it's worth noting that a few things are clear across the country and in New Hampshire, where it's been demonstrated that commercial property reduces the property tax rate because it generates taxes and it doesn't create children. The second best kind of property is undeveloped property, conservation land in particular. And it's great to have lots of conservation land because it's very inexpensive to manage. It doesn't increase property taxes, but it doesn't generate a lot of taxes either. So it's pretty neutral. But when you get into housing, as a general rule, the more housing you have, the higher your property tax rate is, because children are the most expensive aspect, particularly here in New Hampshire, where we rely on property taxes for our schools. If you're in Moulton Borough and your housing is all on the lake and they're second homes and there are no kids in the local schools living in those multi-million-dollar places, great, no problem at all. But for most of the rest of us, and particularly where the housing is year-round and low cost, that's where young families with kids go, and that's where property taxes increase.
So just to be clarifying, since we have realtors who advertise in the paper,
I know.
This wasn't a local article. In fact, I think we picked it up off of New Hampshire Business News or something, and we do that. You know, we have a news exchange just for a matter of interest, I suppose. So most newspapers now and media exchange information. It's a pretty nice arrangement. So we don't subscribe to Associated Press anymore because they really don't have much of a presence in New Hampshire. And in fact, they don't cover the State House really anymore. And but Nancy West, who was the longtime reporter at the Union Leader, started an organization called indepthnewhampshire.org, which anybody can go to. It's on the website. She's very good. So we pay her to republish her articles, a lot of them. But anyways, so what
I'm
is
sorry, just a note, I subscribe to that. In-Depth New Hampshire does a very nice job.
Yeah.
The New Hampshire Business Review, which did promote this particular article and where you took some information, was bought, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago by somebody, and the quality of their reporting has really declined, which is a shame.
Okay, well, I'll bring that up at the end. I'm on the board of the New Hampshire Press Association.
Okay, you can cite me, yes.
Sure. But, so what, I mean, just to broaden that out, that theme for a minute, what is the answer? Because Josh Bruston at Pinkham, he's a big advocate and very involved with affordable housing. And I realize everybody has a self-interest, right? I call it an enlightened self-interest.
Yeah.
You have a dog, right? You're good to the dog. You're good to the dog, so the dog's good for you, right? It's an enlightened self-interest. And I only say that because I was caretaking a dog for a month, and I'm not anymore. But I mean, what is the answer? I mean, here, you get these cross currents here in Conway about too much development, not enough development. Planning board wants to, basically control commercial development, and that's going to be coming up in the news in the next couple of months as they have established this corridor where they only going to allow certain size buildings. Okay, you do that, but then they're all about wanting affordable housing. Well, affordable housing, regardless of what it is as a tax, it brings more people. More people is like, how many more people? I mean, I think I've asked this before in other interviews, but is there a point where a small community like ours just says, okay, we're kind of done. Let's dismantle the Chamber of Commerce. And it's kind of like what Trump's trying to do. Let's dismantle some big agencies here and let's see what happens.
I don't have an answer. I think that that America doesn't have an answer. You have the spiffy, fancy vacation towns, the Jackson Holes and the Aspens and so on, but they're almost like sort of little fake towns. They're almost not real, and the people who work them and actually do the work to support all the wealthy people who are vacationing in those places really struggle to live there. They're often commuting long distances, and it's sort of a little magic kingdom. Conway has it a little bit easier in the sense that we could just push a button, and by we, probably the state legislature or perhaps the courts, could simply declare short-term rentals as in residential zoned areas as being illegal, and that would free up plenty of housing for local people, and it would make it much more affordable. That's the right thing for the town of Conway to do with regard to the housing issue. With regard to the commercial development in town, boy, the horse is kind of out of the barn. So we have a highly developed strip, nothing cute or beautiful or New Englandy about it. Planning board in Conway does the best it can with regard to some of the design issues of the buildings and so on, but that's gone. It's what it is. It's going to stay that way. Settlers Green, I think, tries to do a nice job and get stuff off the strip, and attracts some nice retailers and creates an economic activity for the area. But it's really the two ends of town that would be nice to maintain, the North Conway as a cute little village, and try to figure out what to do in Conway Village, and try to spiff up Conway Village, make it a little bit more of a local business kind of area, office area, and so on. I tend to think that would be the way to go. Population issues, there are too many people in the world, there are too many people in America. I would be happy with fewer people.
well, you and Bill Marvel can have a drink together, because that's his answer to everything, is
just
the
fewer
bubonic
people.
plague. But I mean, the challenge we have, and I'm not so much pro-development in the sense of just for the sake of it, but I just don't have an issue with this. With the strip. I don't have an issue with the hotels, the Scenic Vista Hotel. There used to be a Grand Hotel there 100 years ago. And, I was a judge at the Festival of Trees down at Settlers, so I was there 2 Friday nights ago in the evening, and there was snow on the ground. It was pretty.
Yeah.
And, and I came through town last night, actually, through down the strip at night. I don't know, but the challenge is that unlike a lot of places, like in Bozeman, they have a cute little downtown, and then they have their big box store someplace else. But Route 16, obviously we're different here. We're all together. Yeah. We got the cute, we have our quaint North Conway Village, which, the big property owners have maintained that, the Berries for one. And, but it's also a truck, truck access. So it's a tough one for us.
Yeah, the people of Berlin need to have access to the outside world, so Route 16 is going to stay busy. I think of Keene being similar to the Bozeman model, where they have really a very nice little downtown and the village square and the gazebo and all that, and then the big box stores are a mile or two out of town. Littleton did a similar job, put them out by the highway. And you're right, the strip's done. That's what it is, and it's going to replace one box store with another. The smaller stores are going to tend to be eaten up over time. But I think doing a good job with regard to the two ends of the strip is probably the planning board's, should be the planning board's focus.
Yeah, and Conway Village, once they're going to, next year they'll be redo the intersection where your property was. And, it looks pretty, you look at building by building, it's not unattractive anymore. I mean, there's a few blights, the one on the corner across from you or whatever where Ole Gregory had his office in there or whatever it was. But anyway, you mentioned Berlin, which is a little bit shift in topic. And what do you think about our state House and the election? I mean, the Republicans, it used to be like a couple of seats that was differentiated the Republicans and Democrats, and now it's wider. And the point I'm going to bring up is Berlin. And Berlin is such a microcosm, I think, of the state and nationally, because Berlin, I'm a Berlin guy, and so it was fully Democratic because all the mill workers, heavy union, classic, like, the Rust Belt old cities. And Paul Grenier, who's the mayor, was a classmate of mine. He lost 2 years ago. Why did he lose? And he's been a great mayor, and he lost to a 40-year-old Republican, right? And then with this last election, all the Democrat reps were replaced by Republicans up there. So instead of the old mill workers of my generation, the old Democrats, not that I was I wasn't that part of that world, but they're replaced by younger people without great jobs who tend to drift towards Republicans. Yeah.
So I mean, you said it yourself. The base of the Democratic Party in Berlin were the union workers and their families, and the unions are largely gone from Berlin. Those employment positions aren't available anymore. They used to have great benefits. When I was administrator for Northern Human Services, the area that we covered went from Wolfboro to Littleton to Colebrook and down to Berlin. The only place where we really collected decent insurance money for mental health care was in Berlin, because the union had great insurance coverage. That's all gone. And so now you're looking at really the issue across all of America, which is particularly male, but the middle class and lower middle class working families and their lack of interest in what the Democratic Party has become. And I don't think it's so much that the Republican Party has won their hearts, but the Democratic Party has gone out in their own little planet on stuff, and they become very focused on identity politics, on racial groups, ethnic groups, and keep changing their pitch depending on who they're talking to, focus on very tiny minorities. I don't want anything bad to happen to transgender people. I don't care if they want to change genders and all that stuff. But once you start making that a focus of interest, then you've lost 99-point-something% of the American people in terms of a lack of interest in that particular topic. So the Democratic Party in New Hampshire and in general has lost its way. It doesn't have a message that resonates with young people playing basketball a few years ago. 2016, in the primaries in 2016, you had an open seat. Obama was done, and so you had both Republicans and Democrats running. And the 25-year-olds I'm playing basketball with, I'd say, who are you going to vote for in the primary? And they'd say, well, we can't decide. We're either going to vote for Trump or Sanders.
Yeah.
And I'd say, what? Those are people who are direct opposites. And they'd say, yeah, but they're both going to change things. We don't want to keep doing what we're doing. And that's what happened. Kamala Harris was a representative of the same old thing, and that was not appealing to a vast swath of Americans. There's one other point that I think is really important, and that is we've pretty much crossed the line and past the Gilded Age, the age of the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Mellons and all those people back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in terms of income inequality in America. That was when it was last at its peak, where you had really rich and a handful of those, and a great many poor people. We're back to more or less that same situation in America, where we have a tiny sliver of Americans who are very wealthy and a great many Americans who aren't doing all that well. And the country hasn't responded to that, and the country hasn't found a way to deal with that, just except, I suppose, to fill the cabinet with billionaires, which is one approach that the new president will take.
I feel like you're the moderator here, and I'm going to ask you a ridiculous question.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so guess how much Warren Buffett, Warren Buffett is the sage of, everybody knows who he is. He's worth $150 billion. So guess how much he's left his kids. Now, and I'm going to say, before I say that, it's a great, I'm paraphrasing here. He says, I want to leave them enough they can do what they want, but I don't want to leave them so much that they don't do anything.
Yeah. So I don't know. My assumption is that it's less than 1% of his wealth.
10 million each.
10 million each, and that's a perfectly nice number. But it's an interesting point. The current inheritance tax maximum that a couple can leave to folks is about $26 million without any taxes.
Right.
$26 million without one penny of inheritance taxes. And that sort of drives me nuts. As Warren Buffett points out, 10 million bucks is plenty to get people off to a perfectly good start. Why are we allowing $26 million to be handed down from one generation to the next? Because all that does is concentrate the wealth in those families. That money produces more money. Recently saw some other numbers. In the past, when our middle class was at its peak in the 50s and 60s and so on, about 2/3 of all the income in America was earned income. People went to work and they got a paycheck, and that's where 2/3 of the income came. But 1/3 of the income, even back then, was interest and dividends and capital gains and essentially generating money from money. Today, we're just about down to 50% of the income in America being from earned income, and the other nearly 50% comes from unearned income, comes from Social Security and government sources, it comes from welfare payments, but largely comes from interest and dividends and capital gains from people who have money, who are generating more money. That creates bitterness in a country, and it creates a country of haves and have-nots. It creates the sort of horror of the CEO of an incredibly expensive, valuable company getting shot, and they keep saying broad daylight, but the very early morning hours in Manhattan on a busy city street. There's bitterness, there's anger. And if you go back to 1900, you had anarchists throwing bombs, and you had assassinations. You had J.P. Morgan being attacked, and you had the governor of Colorado being murdered. I think it was Colorado. And you had great disruption. You had violence, but most of all you had anger. And there's a lot of anger today,
Right.
and I think a lot of it revolves around income inequality.
I do, and even Reagan, and we only have 8 minutes, so I want to get to a couple more topics here, and because you're on fire today. You're always
rolling.
on fire. But but even Reagan talked about the inequality with wealth, and that is an issue. And it's, particularly right now in these last few years, between the stock market going up, I just heard on the way in that the stock market's gone up 25% for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
That's, if you have $1 million, all of a sudden you get $1,500,000 in 2 years without doing anything. I mean, it's a lot of money, and never mind the housing, right? I mean, the average age, my kids are in their early 30s, and the average age a generation ago in our generation was early 20s when you bought a house. Yeah. It is now 38 years old, the average age, and about half of those people are getting help from their parents.
For the first home.
For the first home, 38. I mean, so if you're not even in that world and have parents that can help, you're being further left behind. I want to get to the, you're talking about the income inequality, but I want to talk about outliers for a second. I consider myself a little bit of an outlier because I'm an entrepreneur. I think any entrepreneur business guy kind of is. And you're a teacher. You didn't go the institutional route. You started your own business. So I consider you an outlier. Are you an outlier?
Absolutely.
Okay. So what do you think about the idea that Trump has basically a bunch of outliers? And when you think of government, people in government, I mean, regardless of what their politics are, they usually, like if you're in school administration, you're a certain type of person. You like that structure. You like big corporate world. You like institutions. You're in government. You tend to be the same thing. So you don't get the George Epsteins in government so much because you're doing your own thing. You're an outlier. So here we have Trump bringing in a bunch of outliers, good or bad. They're bringing them in. And, even for a person who is an anti-Trumpster, I'm really anxious to see how they're going to do.
Yeah, I think it's fair to be curious and to start with something of an open mind. But to me, it's a little creepier than that. Sure, he's filling his cabinet and surrounding himself with advisors who are reasonably called outliers, but they strike me as opportunistic outliers. They're taking advantage of the dissatisfaction of a broad swath of Americans, the Americans who aren't outliers, and they're manipulating them. They're and gaining office, gaining power, and gaining money by taking advantage of those folks and the dissatisfaction they have. And the Democrats haven't found any way to offset that by producing competent, capable, and exciting and inspiring candidates. Their candidates suck. Am I allowed to say that? So this is what we have, where a majority of the American people are supporting a government of outliers, and almost by definition, you can't be an outlier if the majority has put you in place. But I don't like the way that they're responding. Tariffs are the best example. Don't worry, tariffs aren't going to raise the price of the sweatshirt that you buy at Walmart. They will raise the price of the sweatshirt you buy at Walmart that comes from China, and so they lie and they're taking advantage of that level of dissatisfaction.
Right. And also there. I mean, so I was throwing out the general idea of outliers, and I'll just do a quick example. But you could also go, are they qualified? I mean, is Tulsi Gabbard qualified? No. Was Matt Gaetz qualified? No. Is the Defense Department, whatever his name is, is he? No. But RFK, your favorite guy. So he's talking about, it's interesting, I interviewed the nutritionist from Memorial Hospital last week, and she was talking about how you shouldn't eat vegetable oil because the way it's high pressured, how the seeds and all that. So that's one of RFK's things. He doesn't like the vegetable oil. So I read this article from The Atlantic trashing RFK about his stance on vegetable oil. That he wants people should use butter and tallow and stuff like that. So it's like, okay, it'll be interesting to see what someone like that does, because those are real issues.
The problem with RFK specifically is that he is not a scientist, and in fact is perfectly willing to ignore good science on important topics. And the whole thing about a stop clock is right twice a day. Sure, he might well be right about, I don't know anything about vegetable oil, but he might be right about, I'm sure he is right, about certain foods not being good for us, and he's going to attack some of that stuff. But the other stuff is awfully scary. The anti-science, the anti-medication, the anti-vaccine stuff.
Fluoride in water.
The fluoride in the water. Wow, that was killed off in the 60s, that crazy, it was a communist conspiracy.
Right.
My teeth are terrible. My kids' teeth are great. It's not genetic, it's because they got fluoride on their teeth. And I didn't growing up because the anti-communists in the 50s in New Jersey wouldn't let the communities put fluoride in the water, and the dentists weren't smart enough to rub some on our teeth. That's bad, and he shouldn't be confirmed, and I certainly hope he wouldn't be confirmed. Some of the other folks that he's putting in place are interesting people. I wrote a column on cryptocurrency, and that's a very scary experiment to dive into. Not scary because investors are going to lose money or gain money. That's the problem of investors. The threat to the dollar is the scary part of that. We need the dollar, and arguably it's our most important strategic asset, is that the dollar is the basis of world trade. And if that strength of the dollar is lost by handing it over to a challenging currency that's not associated with our government, then that's going to create a weaker America.
Right, but the counter argument to that is crypto is just a store of value. It's like gold,
And that would be great if people treated cryptocurrency as an investment like gold, that it's simply something rare. Which it is, and mathematically it will stay rare. At least Bitcoins and some of them will stay rare. The threat is laws that require acceptance of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies as currency, that stores have to accept it the way they have to accept U.S. currency, and transactions being required. That will boost the value of Bitcoin substantially, but that creates a threat to the dollar and will weaken the dollar as the currency for the world. You have right now China, India, a couple of other places getting together and talking about creating a joint currency among themselves, like the euro was created out of the EU. The Chinese recognize that the biggest weakness they have on the world stage is they don't have a currency that plays, that the dollar is the key currency for the whole world. That's why they own lots of dollars, is because they need that to support their own currency. So the dollar is a
So
really
we
important
we only have a minute left, George. As the time does go by quickly. Any predictions on these on the Trump administration in 30 seconds? In the Trump administration, what do you think? I mean, it could be the end of the MAGA movement, and if they just fall apart, I mean, with some of these cabinet officials, or maybe we're in for a run of republicanism for the next 10 or 15 years.
The country, America, has done a good job of not letting the pendulum swing too far in one direction or the other. So you've gone a long way down the MAGA road here with this re-election. The majority vote, he actually got the popular majority, which he didn't in 2016, and obviously didn't.
And you
in
sure that
2020.
wasn't stolen, right?
Best of my knowledge. And so my guess is that there'll be enough problems that will arise over the next 4 years that the pendulum will tend to swing back. But the Democrats can't simply be the party of not Trump. Right. They have to have a message, and they haven't had a message. And so I would assume we'll swing somewhat back to the middle. The likelihood of tariffs and mass deportations of illegal aliens in the country will drive up prices in the country. Certainly the tariffs will, and eliminating all those workers, particularly from the food industry, you're going to drive up food prices potentially really substantially. So you'll see inflation under Trump if he does the things he says he's going to do, and people won't react well to that. We've seen that. So I tend to think it'll swing back, fingers crossed, and the hope is nothing too crazy occurs that we have to live with.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll find out. And George, it's always a pleasure, and we'll see you next month.
Yeah.
Okay, take care.
Look forward to it.
Okay.